For the British, the Battle of the Somme symbolizes the Great War. A battle that seemed to have served no purpose and was fought in Dantean conditions. It was the deadliest battle of the whole war. On the very first day of the fight, nearly 20,000 British soldiers were killed. Most of them were volunteers. Throughout this battle, whether they were from the British Isles, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa or India, they fought with immense courage, determination and self-sacrifice against the fiercely defending Germans. When so few kilometers were gained at the cost of so many lives, many authors have denounced the incompetence and insensitivity of the British generals. This view is far too restrictive. First of all, it should not be forgotten that alongside the British were the French, an army of roughly equal numbers. But, more importantly, very few authors have mentioned the command of this battle was French. It had been devised by the French General Staff and the man who led the battle was General Joffre, the French Generalissimo. Of course, the British generals made mistakes during the Battle of the Somme. However, some of these were in fact attributable to the French High Command whose instructions they were following. This battle had two objectives. Firstly, it was necessary to save the French who were cornered at Verdun and close to succumbing to the German onslaught. Secondly, the Allies had to regain the initiative in this war. The Battle of the Somme was only a part of a grand Allied strategy that had been prepared at the end of 1915 and which should have led to the Allied victory. In this film, 1916, The Battle of the Five Empires, we will see how all these events would come together and why, just as their victory seemed assured, the Allies would squander this opportunity. We will also see that the British made a far greater and more decisive contribution than historiography tells us. This film is based on unpublished sources that have come to light during the centenary. It also uses British, French, German and Austrian archives which are now digitized, giving access to documents which were previously inaccessible. Finally, it benefits from the personal papers of General de Castelnau, the second in command of the French armies. In 1916, the Great War was still only a war between European coalitions. First of all, the so-called Entente comprised of three empires: France with its large colonial empire, the vast Russian Empire, and the British Empire, which was indeed the world's leading power at that time. The Entente was joined by smaller allied states, Belgium, Serbia, Italy, Portugal, and Japan. So, in terms of finance, economy, industry and demography, this coalition superseded the other coalition formed by the German and Austro-Hungarian empires. This coalition would be called the Central Powers. It was soon supported by two smaller allies, Turkey and Bulgaria. On a military level, history books emphasize the apparent balance of power. In 1915, they counted 250 divisions and about 20,000 cannons in each coalition. In reality, the situation was a lot more nuanced. Germany was a military giant with the strength of 170 divisions in 1916, and its armament, methods, supplies and logistics were of the highest standard. In particular, its army had acquired modern heavy artillery that outperformed that of the Entente, which would not catch up until 1917. Germany also had an excellent rail network that allowed to move troops from one front to the other at any point in time. All the other land armies involved in this conflict had major weaknesses. The Austrian army was modern, but suffered from a major handicap: it had incorporated soldiers from 11 different nationalities who spoke their own language. With 100 divisions, the French army had reached the maximum of its capacity in terms of manpower because of its demography, which was twice as small compared to Germany, and its heavy artillery was old, which greatly diminished its offensive capacities. The British Army, on the other hand, was very small as it only recruited volunteers. The Russian army was poorly organized and badly commanded. The armies of the other allies in the two coalitions, the Belgians, Italians, Serbs, Turks, and Bulgarians, could in no way be compared with those of the five empires, neither in size nor in modernity. During 1915, the Central Powers would gain the upper hand. Thanks to the overpowering German army, they were able to contain the French army and the small British army on the Western Front despite the numerous offensives that were launched. On the Eastern Front, from the spring onwards, the Austro-German forces pushed the Russians, who were forced to retreat by abandoning Poland. Italy's entry into the war on the side of the Allies did not change the balance of power. In October 1915, Bulgaria joined the Central Power Coalition. The encircled Serbia was crushed in a few weeks. By the end of 1915, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria and Turkey formed a single geographical bloc with perfectly interconnected railway lines. German and Austrian troops could thus move continuously and very quickly from one front to the other, enabling them to fight systematically from a position of numerical superiority. The Allies had had a very difficult year in 1915. On the Western Front, the French army and the small British army launched numerous unsuccessful offensives which had no result other than to create huge losses. In the Mediterranean, a strong Australian and New Zealand contingent failed to drive the Turks from the Gallipoli Peninsula. The impossibility of opening the straits posed a serious problem of connections between the three main allies, the British, French, and Russians. They no longer had land communications, which created important logistic constraints. The sea route to Russia took several weeks and was closed for 6 months of the year. In order to defeat the Central Powers, a real common strategy had to be implemented in 1916. The idea was to launch a general and joint offensive on all fronts. To achieve this, the size of the Russian and of the British armies had to be significantly increased and important number of new divisions had to be created. The problem was that it would take several months to achieve this. However, the Allies had a very effective weapon at their disposal, the naval blockade they had set up at the beginning of the war thanks to the power of the British fleet. High-speed coastal boats crisscrossed the sea day and night. Deprived of raw materials and especially of some of their food resources, the Germans and Austro-Hungarians were in a very difficult situation. Hunger riots had broken out all over Germany. For the German Chief of Staff, General Falkenhayn, it was urgent to react before the British Empire, which the Germans considered to be the most dangerous opponent, had time to build up its great army. His plan was simple: attack the French army on the Western Front. The French, very weakened by the immense losses suffered during 1915, appeared to be exhausted. By attacking them, the Central Powers could hope to force France to sign a separate peace agreement. So, on the 21st of February 1916, the Germans launched their great offensive on Verdun. Many thought that the fate of the war was being decided at Verdun. The French seemed to be resisting, but for the Allies, it was primarily a race against time. They could only hope that the French hold out until the British Empire could engage its future great army. In an attempt to draw German troops to the Eastern Front and relieve the pressure on the French at Verdun, the Russians launched a major offensive at the end of March in the Lake Nauk region, but the attack failed with huge losses. Meanwhile, under the leadership of Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, the British were developing their army. As the recruitment of volunteers was not enough, conscription was decreed. Little by little, the Kitchener army developed. The British war industry was growing and delivering weapons of a high standard. In 1916, The British soldiers were the best equipped of the belligerents. In an attempt to discourage the British, Germany intensified submarine warfare. Many ships were sunk. In order to terrorize the civilian population and discourage British participation in the conflict, Germany also launched Zeppelins attacks. These gigantic airships operated at night and bombed homes in many parts of the British Isles. But on 15 May 1916, an event occurred that radically altered the situation and set off a chain reaction that reversed the initiative in favor of the Allies. The Austro-Hungarians attacked the Italians in the Alps. This offensive should have never taken place. General Falkenhayn had been very clear with the Austrians. While the Germans were attacking at Verdun, they should remain in defensive positions on the Eastern Front and against the Italians. However, for the Austrian Chief of Staff, General Hutzendorf, the operation was too tempting. He knew that by attacking the Italian fortified line in the Trentino, he could break through to Venice and trap the bulk of the Italian armies massed at the eastern end of the country on the Isonzo River. Such a success would ipso facto lead to an Italian capitulation. At the beginning of 1916, his confidence grew stronger as he had just gained a great victory in Bukovina over the Russians. Euphoria now predominated within the Austrian General Staff. Without telling Falkenhayn, Hutzendorf prepared instructions for this offensive. On the 15th of May, Austrian troops' assault began. Within a few days, they pierced the Italian fortified belt in the mountainous area. They emerged in the plain. In Italy, anxiety had reached a new height. The Italian commander-in-chief, General Cadorna, asked General Joffre to intercede with the Russians to launch their great offensive planned at Chantilly as quickly as possible. Joffre and the Russians agreed on a compromise: they would anticipate only part of this operation. By engaging his best troops in the Alps, Hutzendorf had dangerously thinned his lines on the eastern front against the Russians. Yet he had done so while the Germans themselves had transferred troops to Verdun and the Russians had, on the contrary, strengthened significantly. This was to have the most serious consequences. During the same period another major event took place, this time at sea. Since the beginning of the war, British had put in place a very efficient naval blockade. On North Sea and in the Channel, British speedboats would control all naval access to Europe. This blockade suffocated the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. Having failed to reduce it through the submarine warfare, the only way to break the blockade was for the Germans to attempt to defeat the Great British Grand Fleet. On the 31st of May 1916, the German High Fleet went on sea and the most important naval battle began between the north of the British Isles and Norway. Late afternoon and throughout the night, dozens of ships were firing at each other. At the end of the night, the German Admiral Hipper realized that he could not defeat the much more powerful British fleet. He then ordered the return to base. During this battle, many battleships on both sides were destroyed. When the first news filtered through in the aftermath of this confrontation, it suggested that Britain had been defeated. At first sight, numbers seemed to be in favor of the Germans. But, little by little, the idea of a victory of the Grand Fleet emerged as new information showed that the Germans had probably concealed most of their losses. One thing was obvious: the German fleet was out of action for the rest of the war. It was no longer able to weaken the British blockade. On the contrary, the blockade could be reinforced. To save the Italians from the rout they seemed doomed to, Joffre and the Russians had therefore agreed to launch the Brusilov army group in a diversionary attack against the Austrians. The other two Russian army groups would not participate and would reserve themselves for the Great Allied offensive planned for the 1st of July with the start of the Battle of the Somme. Four Austro-Hungarian armies and a mixed army comprising of German and Austro-Hungarian troops were facing the Russians. The Austro-Hungarian defences on the Eastern Front were far from having the same density and defensive power as those on the Western Front. The Austro-Hungarians' ability to resist was greatly reduced by another element, a false sense of security. Discipline had become much more lax. The Russian attack was to take them completely by surprise. On the 4th of June 1916, after a short bombardment, the Russian infantry assault began late in the afternoon. On a front of 300 kilometers, Brusilov launched 4 attacks which forced the Austro-Hungarians to disperse their reserves. Within a few days, to the north and south, the Austro-Hungarian defences collapsed and 2 large pockets were created. From the 20th of June, more than 125,000 Austro-Hungarian prisoners were taken by the Russians, as well as 400 cannons and trench mortars, not counting thousands of machine guns. At the end of June, this victory grew to the point where almost 500,000 Austro-Hungarian prisoners fell into Russian hands. This Russian victory, and the Austro-Hungarian rout it caused, were totally unexpected. If the situation was not rectified, it would inevitably lead the Russian armies into the Hungarian territory. Therefore, it would force the Austro-Hungarians to sign a separate peace agreement before Germany could rescue them, as suddenly, on the Western Front, British and French began to launch the Battle of the Somme. The attack was to begin on the 1st of July. For the British, who were to make the main effort, this offensive started far too early. They were far from being ready. A majority of British combatants had no experience of the war. They had been just recruited a few months ago through a gigantic volunteering recruitment program. It was not just a manpower issue. This British army was far from having received the artillery supplies it would need. It only possessed 362 heavy guns to cover a 27 km front, half of what the French was able to engage on a 12 km front. The newly created armament factories could not deliver the right type of shells. There were not enough high-explosive shells for wire cutting and the destruction of deep dugouts. A significant portion of the shell would not explode due to a fabrication default. The part of the front that the British were going to attack was one of the most fortified, a set of trenches, supports and reserves, as well as a labyrinth of dugouts and tunnels. It was preceded by a double barbed wire fence, respectively 30 meters long and 15 meters deep. However, the Commander-in-Chief, General Haig, and the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Robertson, had decided to take that risk because the French were in such desperate situation at Verdun. The bombardment that preceded the British troops' assault would last a whole week. The British High Command expected it to be decisive so that the infantry could attack in the best conditions. On the 1st of July, the British infantry came out of their trenches and attacked. Most of the battalions had to cross a large no-man land for more than 500 meters. Due to the poor efficacy of the bombardment, many of them found themselves under German machine gun fire before they could even reach their lines. It was a massacre. 20,000 men were killed and 40,000 wounded. On more than half of the attacking front, the British were pushed back into their lines. On east of the Albert Bapaume Road, however, they achieved their objectives. On the 2nd and 3rd of July, in this part of the front, they were able to complete the conquest of the entire first line of German defences, which offered important strategic prospects, because at the same time, south of the Somme, the French were winning a spectacular victory. Contrarily to the British, the French benefited from many advantages during their attack. First of all, they had been able to select their best formations for the assault, and had well-trained soldiers and a large number of heavy guns. They could use massive amount of high explosive shells. Last but not the least, Due to the proximity of the German lines, the French bombardment was terribly efficient. The barbed wire networks were breached, and a significant part of the German artillery was destroyed. The French started the assault at 7:30. At 10:30, the entirety German first line of defense was between their hands. The first patrols set off to explore the surroundings to the second position. Meanwhile, the field artillery moved forward, taking advantage of the perfectly dry ground. For 2 days, the French troops pushed relentlessly against the increasingly disorganized Germans. On the morning of 3rd July, all the German defensive positions had been seized. Over a stretch of more than 10 kilometers, there was no longer any resistance. The few German defenders had fled, leaving behind 100 guns. French losses were minimal. On the 3rd of July, it was clear that the Allied had achieved a limited success north river but very large one on the other bank. For the French Chief of Staff, General de Castelnau, a new plan was necessary. The attack south of the Somme had to be continued. Let us have a look at these maps. Initially, the Allied wanted to break through to the northeast in order to move in the direction of Cambrai. But, as the German defense lines had not been destroyed during the 1st of July British assault, it was logical to move the axis of the offensive southwards where all the German defense lines had been destroyed. The two French corps would charge southwards while the neighboring French armies would attack. Caught in a vice, the Germans had no chance. Taking advantage of the open ground, the French cavalry would rush to the few bridges across the Somme and across the vast marshland to control them and prevent German reinforcements and ammunition on the right bank from crossing. On the whole, the Germans were struggling with reinforcement. 4 of their destroyed divisions had to be replaced urgently. 5 other divisions were fragmented in small groups, which strongly reduced the operational capacity of these troops. As for the 5 divisions of reinforcements capable of intervening effectively, their arrival would take place between the 5th and the 9th of July. During 1 week, the German would be extremely vulnerable. The French attack to the south would end up with the capture of 100,000 Germans and the conquest of a large salient along the Somme. Castelnau had foreseen this scenario. A few weeks before the battle, on the 11th of June, he had prepared the plans for this hypothesis. General Haig and the Imperial Chief of Staff, General Robertson, shared his analysis. Haig was preparing his instructions for British troops to support this French attack on the south. On the 3rd of July at 3 o'clock, Generals Joffre and Foch decided to meet Generals Haig and Rawlinson in order to communicate their decisions for the next days. But while Haig and Rawlinson thought they would be asked to support the great French attack towards the south, Joffre ordered them to immediately resume the British attack towards the north. There was no longer any question of a French attack. For Haig, these decisions of the French Generalissimo seemed incomprehensible. Firstly, they were unenforceable. The British troops were still totally disorganized by the murderous assault of the 1st of July. In any case, there would not have been enough artillery ammunition to immediately relaunch an assault of such magnitude against such fortified Germans. Secondly, it was in total contradiction with what Castelnau had planned for such a scenario. South of the Somme, the French troops were advancing over open ground and there was no more resistance in front of them. The day before, on the 2nd of July, Joffre himself was ready to order this French attack as he mentioned it in his war diary. Nevertheless, in the afternoon of the 3rd of July, following Joffre instructions, General Fayolle, commander of the French Sixth Army, overturned the attack orders of his subordinates and ordered them to stop their advance. You would find more details about this episode in Benoit Chenu's book, 1916, The Battle of the Five Empires, now available in English. The author reveals the confusion that reigned within the French High Command. He shows how a mistake that huge had been made. Indeed, the 8th of July, Joffre realized it and instructed Foch to launch this French attack towards the south. But 5 days had been lost. In the meantime, the Germans had been able to bring in reinforcements, and when the French went on the attack on the 9th of July, they could not breach the German lines. Thereafter, the Battle of the Somme was to become a war of attrition with a number of casualties never seen before in war. Benoit Chenu also explains how such an event had disappeared from the narrative of this war. Very few works have been published in France about the Battle of the Somme. Verdun takes up the whole of the French memorial space. For years, the only French sources available in English for the Anglo-Saxon authors had been the memoirs of Marshal Joffre and Marshal Foch, whom of course, were careful to absolve themselves of responsibility by accusing the British. However, their case is undermined by what is in the French historical record. French post-war staff work, Testimony of the President of the French Republic, Raymond Poincaré, or the note written by General de Castelnau a few days after this event have been damning for the three French generals Joffre, Foch, and Fayolle. The memoirs of General von Lorsberg, who was in charge of operations on the Somme in the German army, or the analysis produced by the British strategist, Sir Basil Liddell Hart, confirm the serious mistake made by the French High Command. Some authors mention that they did not investigate further the possibility of a French attack south of the Somme. They considered that it could not have significantly changed the strategic situation of the Allies on the Western Front. Benoit Chenu nuances this statement. As General de Castelnau deplored in his personal papers, this broke the confidence of the British command in Generals Joffre and Foch. From that moment on, operations were no longer coordinated between the British and the French. More specifically, no response was found to overcome the new German combat tactics. Dispersing their troops into small groups armed with machine guns and light cannons placed in shell holes, the German would break all British and French assaults. In 3 months of battle, the Allied advance would be limited to a few kilometers at the price of appalling losses. In his book, 1916 The Battle of the Five Empires, Benoit Chenu reveals that this French High Command mistake had actually a deep impact on the whole outcome of the war. It occurred just as the two main Russian groups of armies were about to launch their great offensive against the Germans with a view to fixing a maximum of troops in this region. At the same time, Romania was apprehensive about entering the war alongside of the Allies. As well, Bulgaria was starting to consider reversing its alliance and join the Allies. The concomitance of these three events would definitively force the Austro-Hungarian Empire to ask for a separate peace agreement. On the contrary, the bogging down of the Battle of the Somme discouraged them. The Russian generals, Ivet and Kuropatkin, significantly reduced the scale of their offensive, which didn't prevent the German from rescuing the Austro-Hungarians. The Romanians would delay for 2 months before entering the war, too late to have an impact on the conflict. Last but not the least, France would veto a reversal of the Bulgarian alliances, contrary to the wishes of the British government. While, during the summer 1916, newspapers from neutral countries were predicting a victory of the Allied, due to these mistakes, finally this opportunity would be squandered. The Battle of the Somme remains a controversial subject for the British to this day. This book, 1916, The Battle of the Five Empires, brings new elements that significantly change the vision we had of this event, as it benefits from unpublished information contained in the personal papers of General de Castelnau. These documents remained under embargo until very recently. Aware of the emotion that the revelations they contained could create among the French and British people who had suffered so much from this war, Castelnau had strictly forbidden their communication. He also refused to write his memoirs, unlike the other great Allied military leaders. It should be remembered that Castelnau was the Chief of Staff of the French Army. In this position, he was involved with Lloyd George, Aristide Briand and Joffre in the decisions taken about the war during 1916. He possessed information that only a very limited group of British and French leaders knew and that had never been revealed in historiography, notably about the Battle of the Somme. The author, Benoit Chenu, being the great-grandson of General de Castelnau, therefore had privileged access to his personal papers. He has supplemented them with new historical sources that appeared on the occasion of the centenary. Benoit Chenu places these events in a global context, highlighting their military and diplomatic interactions. He sheds new light on the British contribution to this war, which has often been underestimated in history. After a career in a large international group in managerial positions, Benoit Chenu devotes himself to historical research. He publishes books and holds conferences. He has a particular interest in the period 1914 to 1918. He is a member of the Academy of Moral Sciences of Versailles, and of the British Commission for Military History.
Everything covered in this film is detailed in Benoit Chenu's book, 1916, The Battle of the Five Empires, which is now available in English. You can find it in most English-speaking countries either paperback and hardcover on Amazon and in stores that work with Ingram in UK, USA, Australia and Canada.